Most of my ideas come from my own life. I mean, I think if you talk to any writer, I'm married to a writer, so I know that a lot of the things that he writes about are things that he's thinking about, or things that have happened to him, and certainly in my case, that's where my ideas come from. They come from things that happened to me when I was a kid, and they come from looking at my own children and listening to my children and seeing the other kids at school, really. I have a bunch of different ideas, of course, all based on things that loomed large for me as a child. And when anybody thinks back to their childhood, there are always events that seem to be major events that might be something that a parent or another friend would deem minor. But that's kind of what kids' literature is about. You know, their lives are as big and as rich as ours are. There's just a different kind of scale to them. The title Freckle-Faced Strawberry comes from a nickname I had when I was a kid. When I was 7 years old, we lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and they all the kids in my neighborhood would tease me about my red hair and freckles, and they called me Freckle-Faced Strawberry, which was the name of a drink mix. They were called the Funny Face drink mixes, and they were like Kool-Aid. You know, it was powder and water, and it made like a colored drink. So it was a name that I thought was incredibly humiliating. And then, you grow up and you go, well, that's not so bad. It's kind of cute. And I've actually known other people. I've had other people come up and say, oh, they called me that too. So it was a name that was sort of around when I was growing up. If you ask a redhead, they'll say, oh, I wish I were a blonde, or I wish I had dark hair. I think I still wish that I didn't have freckles. I realize I'm very used to my red hair. I had to dye my hair blonde for a part and was very disoriented. And it was the first time in my life I realized that I'm very heavily identified as a redhead. The freckles I would still ditch in a second. There's a great feeling of solidarity that we have as freckly redheads. I see that, I'll smile at a redhead on the street and they'll smile back, and people will come up and say, I was called Freckle-Faced Strawberry. And I think you do. You kind of bond with each other. I think about my husband, who's got dark hair and dark eyes, and how he ended up with an entire redheaded family, and it must be completely baffling. But there is certainly a fraternity out there of redheads. Growing up, I loved to read. It's the one way I define myself. As soon as I could read, I read constantly. I read every book that I could get a hold of. I read every street sign. I read the back of cereal boxes. I read newspapers. I read notes that were lying on the counter. I read everything. And it was the way that I kind of learned and comforted myself and entertained myself. Because we moved around a lot, it was something that I could take with me, and it became my most defining characteristic, really. The two authors that I really remember the most, that were the most formative for me, were Laura Ingalls Wilder and Louisa May Alcott. And Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House in the Big Woods, I started reading when I was 7, and then I finished that series when I was around 10, and that's when I read Little Women. I would say that those years between 7 and 12, that's what they call the golden age of childhood, and those are probably most formative childhood reading years, and those two authors were the ones that I think shaped me the most. I think one of the most difficult things that we encounter in adulthood is trying to balance work and family. And I always say to people that, I feel like it's a great problem to have. I feel very, very fortunate to have my family and my really beautiful, wonderful children. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have a job that I enjoy. I think the most important thing is to try to find some flexibility in your work. That's been what's been most helpful to me, is to know that, I have hours that I can adjust somewhat. And then also with your children, if your children are seeing you do something that you truly love, if they're seeing you, do work that you enjoy, you're setting a great example for them as well.